when I went on from here, I found myself in a lot of different situations that I never expected to, and I just wanted today to talk about some of them, just kind of zipping through the years really quickly. A few years after I graduated from here, I found myself, for example, in Saudi Arabia, just a few yards south of the border between Saudi Arabia and Iraq. This was during what at the time was called the Persian Gulf War. Now we call it the First Persian Gulf War because, as we all know, a lot of things happened afterwards and there were other invasions and more involvements with and against Iraq to come. And I had gone over to the Middle East for the Detroit Free Press because I was a nice, mild-mannered feature reporter and they wanted someone to go do sweet, emotional features about the troops missing Christmas at home and what they were eating and how they were feeling. So I was there not to do anything important or heavy, but just to kind of write human interest stories. And as the Arab War went on and more time went by, I ended up, through no particular effort, but just by accident, having been what they called in-country in Saudi Arabia longer than most other journalists. So when the ground war was about to begin in March of '91, I think it was, I suddenly was summoned to a meeting and I was told, well, you are one of the senior journalists in country, so you get a prime combat assignment. To which I said, I think I'm going to go home now. No, I didn't. I was kind of stunned, and I thought, well, how do I say no to this? I had no real desire to kind of see bloodshed or cover a war, but I felt like it would be almost a betrayal of my news organization if I didn't take advantage of this opportunity and give them a frontline glimpse of the war. So off we went to northern Saudi Arabia. I was positioned with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and their job was, as we were told in a top secret briefing that we were not allowed to report on, their job was to be the first through the tall sand berm between Saudi Arabia and Iraq, the first through the desert, and they were going to engage the elite Iraqi Republican Guards before any other units did. So I thought, wow, that's really just what I came over here for. But somehow I figured, in for a penny, in for a pound. And on the day the ground war began, I remember there was a long convoy of military vehicles set up right before the berm. There were these things called berm crashers that were creating paths for the vehicles to go into Iraq. And I realized I was very, very far back in a Humvee with 2 media escorts. And I thought, what is the point of going to the ground war and being here? So finding a nerve I never knew I had, I began agitating, and I said, I really want to be closer to the front. I really want to be closer to the front. I really want to be with soldiers. Please do something for me. To my astonishment, it worked, and they kind of walkie-talkied around, and they found out there was a Bradley fighting vehicle right near the front that didn't have the customary 5 soldiers in it, but only had 4, which meant there was an empty seat. And I think they had me sign 5 waivers saying they had no responsibility for anything that happened to me, and that I could go have that seat. Have any of you seen a picture or know anything about Bradley fighting vehicle? Okay, well, it's not the QE2. It's not even a Winnebago. And lucky for me, and much luckier for the U.S. troops, the ground war didn't last for very long. And my 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment was supposed to engage the elite Iraqi Republican Guards, never saw any action whatsoever. But I nonetheless had a kind of unique experience for 5 days. And I'll read you a little bit from a story I wrote afterwards that describes what life was like for the 4 men in that Bradley fighting vehicle, but I'm really describing what life was like for me, the 5th man. It was a battlefield that swept across an endless expanse of desert, but to 4 soldiers boxed in by armor, the war was little bigger than a station wagon. After months of anticipation, they barely got a glimpse of the country they invaded. They rolled across Iraq buttoned up in a Bradley fighting vehicle, 21 feet long and just 10 feet wide, on the outside, but a whole lot smaller inside. Armored vehicles by necessity are a little short of windows. As this Bradley chugged 200 miles across the desert, searching for a war that insisted on remaining somewhere over the horizon, a world within steel walls evolved. The war was between aromas, the loader's Tabasco-slathered tin oysters, versus the commander's spaghetti meal ready to eat, versus the gunner's homemade chocolate chip cookies sent by the wife back home. The challenge was finding space to curl up in the fetal position and sleep. Anything was a pillow, an M16 rifle, a crewmate's thigh. Anything was a footrest, a flak jacket, a gas mask. For these four men, the war was a test not of skill and courage, but of staying sane and contriving comfort in what amounted to an oversized steamer trunk of weapons on wheels, or rather tracks. It was a matter of driving long distances, manning long guard watches, waiting long periods of time to find out where they were moving next, and then learning that the destination promised more of the same. They seldom stepped outside of the Bradley, and when they did, they were instructed not to stray more than a few feet away. Soldiers had been wounded and killed by walking over unexploded munitions in the sand. So the Bradley was their living room, their bedroom, and their dining room. It was their kitchen with a heating vent serving as a stove to warm food. It was their pantry with a box of chocolate-covered cherries tucked behind several rifles. The dread was of having to go to the bathroom on a rainy night, slog outside, grab hold of the front end of the Bradley, and crouch, hanging off the vehicle with your feet never touching the sand, which was possibly a minefield. It was their least favorite position, and mine too. Necessity is the mother of invention, said the soldier with whom I shared the rear compartment of the Bradley, which had two adjacent, uncushioned metal chairs that took up half the space. From there we stared out at an endless desert through four rectangular peepholes, only slightly larger than playing cards. It was like watching Lawrence of Arabia on a microscope slide. That was in March of 1991. By late 1996, I had moved from the Detroit Free Press to the New York Times, and I had the good fortune shortly after I got to the Times to be asked by the guy who was editing the Sunday magazine at the time to occasionally digress from my chores on the Metropolitan desk and write for him. And I just thought, I'd always wanted to write long, colorful magazine stories, and I thought that was the greatest thing, but I was in a constant state of extraordinary nervousness that I was going to bungle an assignment and that was going to be the end of it. And the third assignment he gave me was a profile of the actress Vanessa Redgrave, who was then in London, and she was about to come to New York to do a production of Antony and Cleopatra. And he wanted to have me fly over to London at considerable expense and stay there and interview her. Well, I don't know how many of you have dealt with interviews with lawmakers or celebrities, but it's all about bartering and bargaining and pleading and threatening for access. It's a big game of brinkmanship where you say, well, if I don't get another hour, I can't do it. They say, we'll give you 20 more minutes. You say, if I don't have 20 more, I'm going home, and on it goes. Well, Vanessa Redgrave's publicist was the most unmovable mountain I'd ever encountered. We were flying all the way over there. I was trying to write a 4,000-word profile on her, and I was told, you will get a 60-minute lunch with her, and that's it. So I said to the editor, I shouldn't go. We can't go. And he said, no, just go and see what happens. And I thought, well, what's going to happen? I have an allotted amount of time. Nothing could possibly happen beyond that. A couple days before I left, her publicist called and said, she's in a production in London of Ibsen's John Gabriel Borkman. So we've gotten you a ticket to see it the night you arrive, because you should see what she's doing, and then your lunch will be the next day. So I said, well, can I just pretty please, after the production, just go to the stage door, be allowed backstage, and just get to say hello to her so that when we sit down to this 60-minute lunch, which is all you're going to give me, at least she will know my face already and a little of the ice will be broken. So she thought about it, and she called back a day later, and she said, okay, you can go to the stage door and you can go backstage and meet Vanessa, and then you'll see her the next day. So I go to London, I go to the play is over, I go to the stage door, there's someone there who luckily has been told that I'm allowed to go back. I go back to her dressing room, there's Vanessa Redgrave. I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to just try to photographically memorize everything here, so if I need this scene for a piece, I'll be able to milk it for way more words than it's ever worth. I sit down, I start talking to her, and I immediately get the sense that she is a very distracted, bordering on not all there in the way we think of people being all there person. She just seemed very, very kind of distracted is the best word for it. And as I was chatting with her, she said, so how does this work? And I thought, I don't know what she means, but it sounds like she has no idea or no memory of what her publicist told her about what we're doing. And showing a quickness on my feet that I rarely show, I said, well, I'm buying you dinner tonight. And I kind of waited a bit for her to say, I didn't hear anything about that. And she says, oh, great. Can you pay for it? And I said, yes, I have an expense account. She said, fabulous. What else can you pay for? And I learned that Vanessa Redgrave had given so much of her money away to political causes, and so consistently gave so much of her money away to political causes, that she had very little money, and there was nothing in life more wonderful to her than a freebie. So I said, well, this is really wonderful, Ms. Redgrave, because I'm going to take you to dinner tonight. And then so that you don't have the expense of a cab home, I'm going to bring you home. And tomorrow, what are you doing tomorrow? I'll fetch you in the cab, and I'll bring you to whatever appointments you have, not just to our lunch. And for the next 4 days, I basically was Vanessa Redgrave's cab chauffeur around London. And I went from worrying about not having enough material to having so much taped material. And in fact, because of that, I got to go to her apartment. I never got through the door, and I never got in. But I think the best detail in the piece, and the piece everyone always talked to me about, and the detail that became the headline of the article, was that in this famous legendary actress's home, this woman who had made a lot of money and was theater royalty, in the front hall, first impression for visitors, all that was there was a bare bulb dangling on a loose cord. And that's how Vanessa Redgrave lived. I feel like my entire journalism career has been about, in some measure, trying to get into people's homes. That's kind of the ultimate measure of access. It's if you're doing a profile on someone, you want to see exactly how they live. You want to just be able to say you were in their home because that's a kind of signal to the reader, like, we really got deep inside. And I think the most memorable home visit or home invasion, perhaps I should call it, that I ever made was to George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush's family compound in Kennebunkport, Maine. Many years after Vanessa, I had moved to the Washington, D.C. bureau of the New York Times. I was covering politics. And after just a little bit of time in politics, they said, hey, how would you like to cover the presidential campaign of this guy, George W. Bush, the governor of Texas? And I said, that sounds pretty interesting. And for a year and a half, I ate, breathed, and slept George W. Bush. Not slept with. I don't want any weird blog items out of this. And from the very beginning, one of my goals was to get an interview with his two parents together about him, because they were doing this. They really weren't doing this. And that was something that was very competitive. And so from the very beginning, I was lobbying with George H.W. Bush's representative. Every time I saw them at an event, I would introduce myself and say, I'd love to come talk to you. And lo and behold, one day in I think it was July of 1999 during the campaign, I got word that next week, George and Barbara would have me. They would talk to me. I write about it. I wrote a front page story for the paper about it, but I write about it in a little bit more detail in my Bush book, Ambling into History. So I thought I would just read from there. The Bush family's Kennebunkport compound occupies a bent finger of land jutting out from the Maine coast, and it includes a saltwater pool with an adjacent sauna, a tennis court, a dock, 3 guest cottages, another cottage devoted to office space, and then the big house itself with picture windows that take in the dusky blue breadth of the Atlantic. It's a private peninsula, identified on maps as Walker's Point, named for the former president's forebears, owned by the family for about a century and easily mistaken for a Club Med that floated north and shed its palm trees and acquired some breeding along the way. The Bushes actually use electric golf carts to get from one area of the property to another, and it was in one of these that the 41st President of the United States pulled up to greet me late one morning in early July. Taking in the scene as I watched him approach, I was reminded that George W. Bush's extraordinary luck had been more than a recent phenomenon. It had begun the moment sperm hit egg. The former president instantly put me at ease with conversational niceties. He mentioned his recent and imminent travels and his plans to play 18 holes later in the afternoon with Jeb, who was up north for a visit, Jeb Bush, governor of Florida at the time. A comment of mine about the gorgeous setting elicited a recollection. He said that Sebastian Younger, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, does anyone know? Sebastian Younger, in his book The Perfect Storm, had written that the damage wrought on the New England shoreline by winds and tides had pleased no one, except perhaps a few Democrats, because the Bush's house had taken a hit. The former president said, so I wrote him a letter and said, Dear Stephen, or whatever his name was, I can't believe anybody would be happy. I got the nicest letter back from him. Bush, his personal assistant, and I stepped into the house, and he pointed to the powder room. Anybody want to freshen up? He looked through a window and spotted something that made him smile, a twitching, fascinated Springer Spaniel. There's Sadie, our dog, looking for a chipmunk that comes out of that hole and is eating Barbara's gardens alive, he said. I think, he continued, she now has 6 confirmed kills to her credit. Then, after a second's pause, he added, Sadie, apparently to make sure I had not thought he was talking about Barbara. He also made clear, although perhaps not intentionally, that not all of the attributes George W. Bush had inherited were ideal. The Texas governor's relationship with the spoken word was a bequest from his father, which became evident after the former president and the former first lady took their positions on separate pieces of furniture in the living room and began to bemoan the way journalists sometimes wrote about their eldest son. The other favorite word they got is gravitas, George H.W. Bush said, trying to rebut the various criticisms that had been directed toward George W. It's a Latin word. Meaning, Barbara Bush asked, curious to see where her husband was going with this. Meaning, gravitas, her husband responded. And the answer to that is, I mean, here's a guy that's, talk about an academic record, graduated from 2 of the greatest, 3 of the best schools in the country, and that alone ought to be, I was Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Yale. Nobody said, he's got a lot of gravitas, he's a resume candidate. It's a fallacious argument. And that stupid little question was asked all these different pop quiz here. I couldn't answer those questions, and I'm supposed to know something about foreign policy from having been around. I couldn't answer them today, and I couldn't answer them when I was president. Couldn't pronounce them, Barbara Bush added helpfully. In general, Barbara was talking less, her interjections coming most often when the subject was how President Clinton had behaved in office, and the couple's shared belief that the people's respect for the presidency had, as a result of his behavior, waned. Now, I realize we're far enough away from this at this point that I should remind you that the first President Bush only got 1 term in office because Clinton then beat him. So we're talking, there's some hurt feelings here. At first, Barbara said she was going to resist the temptation to say anything pejorative about Clinton. We took a vow, she said, can't break it, never to speak badly about your... Her voice stopped here short of the word successor. It was as if she was unable to utter it. Her husband said, we don't get into that because he beat me and then it looks like a poor sport. The Bushes had not left 1992 completely behind them, and this seemed an essential part of understanding why George W. Bush was on his current path. You can't blame it all on Clinton, the former president told his wife, referring to what they saw as the diminished station of the presidency. Oh, yes, I can, she responded tartly. You weren't going to do this, he chided, referring to her vow to speak no evil, and here you are. He invoked Clinton to defend his son against charges that the Texas governor knew too little about foreign policy and too little about the world to become president. He knows every bit as much about it as Bill Clinton did, the former president said, and then later, unprompted, returned to the subject, this time casting his net wider. I'm just going back in my mind, he said. You had Reagan, Carter, Clinton. What was their foreign affairs experience? They got elected president. Barbara Bush then chimed in to imply that Gore's, meaning Al Gore's foreign policy experience was not all that positive, and alluding to his awkward toast during a visit to China in 1997 with Prime Minister Li Peng, who had ordered the violent crackdown on protesters in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Barbara said, I don't think we ought to think of Al Gore in China at that time that he got caught with a champagne glass. Oh, no, I'm not going to think about that. What are you doing, George Bush asked her, acting displeased with her caustic interruptions without really seeming the least bit displeased. You're not going to be in this interview if you're going to start talking like that. George will call and he'll be furious. When we moved from the living room out onto the oceanfront terrace for a lunch of lobster salad, he sat on one side of me and he told Barbara to sit snug on the other side. You don't want me to anymore, she said to him, the way I've been talking. And she kept quiet from then on, except when I specifically turned to ask her whether, during those wild, aimless years of her eldest sons that were constantly being dissected and researched, she had ever been concerned about him. Did he have a picture taken nude dancing, she said, trying to anticipate my next question and touching on a widely circulated and never substantiated rumor that someone possessed such a snapshot. The answer is, if they did, where is it? And, her husband added, is it a full frontal shot? From Washington, I went to Rome, where I was the Times Rome bureau chief, and where I found myself covering the Vatican and riding in the papal plane with Pope John Paul II, and at every event of his, kind of checking to make sure he still had a pulse and was still breathing, because in a very ghoulish way, Vatican coverage at the time was about a kind of death watch for John Paul II, because he was such a frail pope. And then one day, when I was in Rome, I got a call from the newspaper asking if I wanted to throw my hat in the ring for the vacant job of restaurant critic. I was utterly shocked by it, but I thought, if they're willing to take a chance on me, sure, I'll take a chance on it. And I said they can consider me, and before I knew it, I was back in New York, and I had this most bizarre of jobs as New York Times restaurant critic. Bizarre for many reasons, including that you're not just any old critic kind of going to something and appraising it. You're not like an architecture critic looking at a building, writing about it. You're not a movie critic just going to the movie and critiquing that. I'd been a movie critic at the Detroit Free Press for a short time. When you're a restaurant critic, you're also a kind of CIA operative. because you're trying to do what you do without being noticed and detected by the restaurant. You know, I mean, you don't care if Francis Ford Coppola knows you're going to see a screening of his movie. There's nothing you can do to change it. But you want restaurants, at the very least, not to know that you're coming to see them, because you don't want them to take kind of extraordinary measures of preparation. So I quickly had to learn about a whole system of making reservations with fake names. I had a dining schedule. I had to dine out 6 or 7 nights a week. There were a lot of restaurants that reserved far in advance, and I had to visit them a certain number of times by X date in order to write my reviews. So I had this sort of Rubik's Cube of a kind of map on my computer where each day I had to know which restaurants to call 4 weeks ahead of time, and it was, and you know, I had to ask for the right numbers of people, and I had to make sure I wrote down all the information. And the one thing I really couldn't get straight in the beginning was the pseudonyms. You have to change your name every time, because if you go into a restaurant and you are recognized, they will note everything they can note, including like what phone number you left on the reservation, what name you made the reservation with, and they'll share that with other people. And that need to constantly come up with new names, for some reason, just froze my brain. And so I was so good at everything, and I would sit there on the phone at home. I had my home number blocked. I had my cell number blocked. You know, there was no possibility of call tracing with me. And then the moment would come when they say, and the name of your party is, and time again I'd realize I had screwed up again and I hadn't written down and agreed on something. So in the early days, I would look up, and I would look up at whatever was around me at my desk. So in the early days, I dined out a couple times as Mr. Webster. I dined out a couple times as Mr. Fodor, Mr. Cheever, Mr. Didion. I was smart enough not to do Mr. Nepal, because I thought that ethnically really wasn't going to work when I showed up. It was going to be pretty obvious. Sometimes I would use one name for a week, because I figured by the time that name got associated with me, I would have cycled through it. And on one week, when I was preparing in advance, and I thought I'd licked some of my problems, I made all of my reservations in the Italian surname Gentile, which is spelled Gentile. But I look at that and I just say Gentile because I speak Italian and I know the correct pronunciation. One of the restaurants I made a reservation in that week was a kosher restaurant in Midtown. And I showed up at the restaurant and I walked up to the hostess stand and I said, "Hi, I'm an 8 o'clock reservation for 4, and the woman looked at me and said, "Oh yes, you're the Gentile party." I dined out as Ben Stiller once, because I was at a loss for a name and I said Stiller, and then they said first name, and the first thing I thought of was Ben. And I subsequently found out that the restaurant, although they thought they recognized me, decided it couldn't be me, because who would dine out with a movie star's name? Dummy me would, right? But I think the job was even funnier when people did recognize you, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about that. This is from my recent memoir, Born Round. When I was legitimately spotted, I usually knew it. The table's server became awkwardly stiff or entirely spastic, while other servers drew close to the table for no good reason and studied me, no doubt because management had told them to take a good look so they could assist in my detection on future visits. If I was spotted 10 or 20 minutes into a meal, the restaurant might swap out a less experienced server for a more experienced one. I was a magnet when recognized for extraordinary courtesy and extreme solicitousness. If it was raining out and I'd arrived at the restaurant unprepared for that, the manager, host, or hostess would try to shove a complimentary umbrella on me. On my way out of many restaurants, there'd be as many as a half dozen workers of various altitudes lined up like flight attendants to say goodbye. Have a good night, hope you enjoyed your evening, good having you, great having you, so great having you, or we look forward to seeing you again. I never believed the last line. It was contradicted by the audible gust of relief I'd hear as soon as the door closed behind me. At L'Atelier de Joel Robuchon in the Four Seasons Hotel, the staff went into a panic when I clumsily spilled some red tomato sauce on my white shirt and I began trying to undo the damage with a wet napkin. Suddenly, a manager was at the table. One of the advantages of being in a hotel, he told me, is that we have laundry services on the premises. We can launder that for you right now. I declined mainly because I didn't want to accept special treatment, but also because I wasn't about to sit in my white V-neck Banana Republic undershirt in the middle of a restaurant that served entrees between $30 and $50. Toward the end of my 4th and final meal at Nobu 57, an uptown successor to the downtown Standard Bearer, I returned from the bathroom with a dark splotch on the front of my tan shirt. Embarrassed, I explained to my companions that I had been klutzy with the soap dispenser. A few minutes later, when our eavesdropping waitress brought the check, she announced that 2 glasses of white wine weren't on it. They'd been removed as an apology for the way the bathroom soap dispenser had malfunctioned. But it didn't malfunction, I assured her. I malfunctioned. I banged way too hard on it and was leaning too close to it. Well, she said, you have our sincere apologies. Not wanting to prolong the awkwardness, I didn't insist that the wine be added back and instead covered its cost with an extra large tip. I got up to leave. As I walked toward the door, a manager intercepted me. Sir, he said, I want to apologize about our soap dispenser. What about it, I asked, though I knew what was coming. Didn't it malfunction, he said. I corrected him and exonerated him. I told him that really, he didn't have to worry. He handed me his card. He said, even so, he said, if you have trouble getting the shirt clean, please contact me. We can pay for dry cleaning or we can get you a new shirt. And it was at this point that I felt the need to draw attention to a crucial detail that suggested the splotch was going to come out pretty easily. It's soap, I said to him. To which the manager added with audible pride, and it is Kiehl's. I was the restaurant critic at the New York Times for 5.5 years. I stepped out of that job in August of 2009. And since then, I have found myself in many more situations I never anticipated. I found myself one day in January of this year riding side by side with Scott Brown in his famous pickup truck. He's the new senator from Massachusetts. I found myself a couple months after that standing next to Dr. Mehmet Oz as he performed open heart surgery and staring into the cavity of a stranger's body. And I mention all of this not... I wish I was mentioning all of this to make a case for journalism as a career, but right now journalism is in a weird place, and I don't know exactly what kinds of careers people going into journalism are going to have. I don't think they know. It's a kind of changing game all the time. I mention it because when I was at Chapel Hill, I sort of fell into journalism. During my freshman year, I lived in Teague Hall. And I met a guy on my hall who wrote for the Daily Tar Heel. And I said something about the fact that during prep school I had written music and movie reviews for my prep school newspaper. And he said, oh, well, you should do that for the Tar Heel. Come down and meet the arts editor. So I thought, oh, that sounds fun. So I went down, I met the arts editor. She assigned me a review of Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which I believe I justly praised. And then I just kept writing, and the next thing I know, they said, you want to write some editorials. And I thought, well, that sounds like fun. I'll write editorials. And they said, well, do you want to be the associate editor who's in charge of the editorial page? And I said, well, that sounds like fun, too. Sure, I'll do that, And on it went. And as graduation approached, I realized I did not have a career plan, and that people actually got paid for this thing I was doing. And so maybe I should try to, do that for a job, at least for a while, and get paid for it. And whenever anybody asked me, why are you going into journalism, I would say because it seems to me like it would be a great passport to a lot of different kinds of adventures. And I said that many times to many people without really even thinking about what I was saying. And as I made decisions along the way to leave the New York Post and go to the Detroit Free Press, I thought, well, that's a more diverse newspaper in terms of what it covers. That will be a passport to a greater number of adventures. And when the Times called me after a couple of years because I'd done some work that had gotten attention, and they said, do you want to come work for us? I thought, well, the New York Times, look at all those sections, look at that Sunday paper. That's going to be the passport to a lot of amazing and different adventures. And every time I was asked if I wanted to take a particular beat that was going to bind me for a long time, I said, well, no, I'd rather bop around. They asked me to go interview Vanessa Redgrave. I said yes. They asked me to cover George Bush. I thought, why not? They asked me to be restaurant critic. I thought, well, that's another kind of adventure. And it really wasn't until recently that I kind of looked back at it all and I said, I thought I was using this phrase as it was a sort of default mantra that meant nothing, but it was actually a strategy and a roadmap. And in fact, it did exactly that. It came exactly true. I have had adventures through journalism in number and of a kind that I never imagined. And what I want to say is, whether you're journalism students, whether you're going in a different direction, have a game plan. Don't be tyrannized by it. I wasn't by mine because I didn't even understand I really had it, but I did. And in kind of having a loose goal in mind and kind of making every decision in line with it, I not only ended up having a passport to adventures, I ended up having a passport to more adventures than I ever thought I'd have, and the soap was Kiehl's. So anyway, I'd be happy to take any questions anyone has. I've been talking for too long.